So, there's this huge conversation happening online right now. Why are so many men leaving the church? It's a question you see popping up everywhere. Today, we're going to dig into one really controversial argument that claims to have the answer, and it all centers on what it calls a crisis of accountability.
So, what's really behind this trend? Well, according to this one perspective, it's not some big crisis of faith. Instead, they argue it's a huge failure in the very structure of the church, a blind spot that's causing some serious damage. And this is where it gets really pointed. The core idea is that there's this massive imbalance in how sin is handled, depending on whether you're a man or a woman. And this imbalance, the argument claims, has some pretty profound and damaging consequences.
All right, so to really get our heads around this, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the accountability crisis itself. Then, we'll explore the controversial red pill reaction that it supposedly causes. After that, we'll dive into the specific hidden sins at the center of this debate, look at the fallout, and finally, check out the call for a new standard.
All right, so let's jump right in. How does this supposed imbalance actually show up in the real world? Well, according to the source we're looking at, it all starts with a story about what people are hearing from the pulpit. The whole argument really comes into focus with this one story about a sermon. For the men in the congregation, the pastor laid out these specific, serious sins: lust, pornography, flirtationships. Pretty direct, right? But for the women, the only thing he said was, "You don't show up." That's it. And this huge difference is basically presented as Exhibit A of the imbalance. Now, this feeling of a double standard, the argument goes, is a huge reason why some men are looking for answers outside the church, in places that the church often warns them about. Okay, to really follow this line of thinking, we have to get a handle on a key term: the red pill. Now, in this context, they're not talking about a movement or some kind of strategy. It's described as, well, just raw data. Intel, as they put it, based on what women actually do, not just what they say. And this leads to a really provocative idea. The source frames this whole red pill phenomenon not as the actual problem, but as a symptom. They call it an allergic reaction to what it sees as the church's failure to be honest about certain behaviors and hold everyone to the same standard. So, the really critical point here is the accusation that church leaders are just shutting the conversation down. The claim is they're totally dismissing these outside observations, but aren't offering their own biblical way of looking at the very same behaviors these men are seeing out in the world. Okay, now we're getting to the heart of the source's evidence. It actually lays out this super detailed list, a taxonomy of specific sins that it claims are just ignored or brushed aside when they're committed by women. This is where the argument gets really, really specific. So let's go through the categories. First up is what they call sins of deception. And we're not just talking about telling a lie, it's about a whole range of manipulative stuff that the argument goes just gets a pass. Things like grifting, which is basically faking your values to get a partner, or using toxic positivity to avoid any real criticism. The point is that these are treated as minor issues, but they can be incredibly damaging. Next, the argument points to sins of vengeance. This covers things like passive-aggressive punishments, the silent treatment, but also much more destructive stuff like making false accusations or intentionally poking and prodding a partner until they explode, and then blaming them for the reaction. They're basically framed as these hidden forms of attack. And to back up that claim about false accusations, the source brings up a US Air Force study. Apparently, it found that something like 60% of certain accusations turned out to be false and were often motivated by revenge. This is used as a major piece of evidence that these behaviors are a real serious problem. Then we get to sins of selfishness. This is a big category, covering everything from emotional dumping, making your feelings everyone else's problem, to withholding affection as a way to control someone. It also points a finger at a lack of self-control, suggesting that consuming what the source calls smut is just as much of a problem as the sins men are so often called out on. Sins of pride are another big one. This is defined as this desire to be worshipped, holding partners to these crazy high standards they can never meet, and refusing to make any personal sacrifices, all while using emotion and social pressure to take control. And finally, this section wraps up with sins of disrespect. It points to things like constant ingratitude, not having any empathy for a partner's struggles, and, this is a big one, the deflection tactic. That's when any critique is met with, "Yeah, but what about what men do?" It's a move that completely shuts down any real accountability. Okay, so after laying out all these different categories of sin, the big question is, so what? What's the real world cost? What actually happens when this accountability gap is just left to fester?
Well, one of the biggest consequences, the source argues, is this total breakdown of trust. You know that idea, that unspoken promise that if you marry someone from the church, you're in this sort of bubble wrap of safety from bad behavior? Well, that's being seen as a complete falsehood, and it's leading to a lot of disillusionment. And from there, the source kind of maps out this tragic downward spiral. It starts when a man is being harmed by these behaviors that the church just won't call out. He goes looking for support and gets nothing. And this, the argument says, kicks off a terrible chain reaction. First, he loses trust in the church, and then he loses trust in God himself. And the end result? Well, the source warns it's this triple threat crisis. You've got men walking away from the church, giving up on marriage altogether, or even worse, turning to these really cynical, secular black pill ideologies, all because they feel the church let them down and didn't have any real answers for them. So, after diagnosing the problem, pointing out the reaction, laying out all the evidence, and showing the consequences, the source ends with a very direct call to action. And really, when you boil it all down, the argument isn't presented as an attack. It's framed as a plea for simple fairness. The whole point, the big call to action, is for the church to just get back to balance and apply the exact same tough standards of accountability to everyone, man or woman. And that leaves us right here with this final thought. The perspective we've just walked through presents a really stark choice. Are faith communities going to move towards a single, equal standard for accountability for everyone? Or is this gender divide we're seeing just going to keep getting wider? It's a tough question, but it's one a lot of people are starting to ask.